So this is a continuation of the third chapter called The Afterlife. On our last reading session, we left off on page 39, right at the bottom. This is when Brent is meeting with Mrs. Zamora as part of the restitution piece. Restitution meaning that he has to make up for killing Leah, Mrs. Zamora's daughter. So we found out that the name on the whirligig where Stephanie and Alexandra were doing their visualization is actually the name of the girl whom Brent killed when he was drinking and driving and decided that he wanted to commit suicide. Mrs. Zamora stared back at her. I don't believe in retribution. Leah was born in the Philippines. I was teaching English and met my husband there. I saw what an eye for an eye looks like, with the rebels fighting the government and all that. My husband feels a little differently. I also believe everything happens for a reason. She toyed with her necklaces, that the universe required this for some reason. So I want you to just pause and think for a moment. There are two huge life lessons in this one paragraph. One, what are your feelings about an eye for an eye? So in some countries, when you steal something, they cut off your hand. They feel that that is adequate retribution. And then the second part that I want you to think about is, do you think that everything happens for a reason? Do you think that it was meant to happen and that the universe, for some order, required an event to happen? So those are really profound questions, and we may not have the answers yet, or we may never have the answers. Mrs. Zamora paused, then directed her words at Brent's parent. Leah had a very caring soul, very strong and generous. Everybody who saw her smiled. They loved her at the hospital where she worked. This summer, she was going to do volunteer work in California. In the fall, she was going to college in Boston. She would have spread joy all over the country. Brent wondered what his own eulogy would sound like. Mrs. Zamora turned her gaze on him. I've thought about you for hours and hours. What can you possibly do for me? Paint the house? Mow the lawn all summer? Her voice had acquired a stronger tremble. She let the questions hang in the air, then looked to Brent's left out the window. My father is a very fine carpenter. Leah was his first grandchild. When she was little, he made her lots of wooden toys. Her favorite was a whirligig of a girl with arms that spin in the wind. He painted the face to look like her. We've had it on a pole in our yard forever. Hundreds of people over the years have noticed it and stopped and smiled, just like people smiled at Leah. She opened her purse, extracted a photo, looked at it, and passed it to Brent. It showed the wind toy in motion. Leah is gone. I'm learning to accept that. I thought I had nothing I could ask you that would help. You can't bring her body back. Then I thought about her spirit. Brent's skin tingled. He stared at the photo, then at her, anxious to hear her bidding. This is my only request, that you make 4 whirligigs of a girl that looks like Leah. Put her name on them. Then set them up in Washington, California, Florida, Maine, the corners of the United States. Let people all over the country receive joy from her even though she's gone. You make the smiles that she would have made. It's the only thing you can do for me. She exhaled. That's what I ask. You must be joking, said Brent's mother. His father strained forward in his chair. This is crazy, he appealed to Miss Gill. That's not the kind of thing you ask for. He faced Mrs. Zamora. And how is he supposed to zip around the country in his private jet? She pulled something else out of her purse. I bought him a Greyhound bus pass, good for 45 days. He can go anywhere. Miss Gill repeated that restitutions weren't imposed, but accepted voluntarily by the offender. Brent's parents raised one objection after another, from his commitment to the emergency room to his need for his family, his non-existent carpentry skills, and the cruel and unusual conditions of bus travel. Brent was oblivious of the arguing. In the quiet storm cellar of his mind, he pondered the proposal. Strange as it was, it would get him away from Chicago, his parents, and his recent past. It would also give him a chance to do penance. He'd never traveled on his own before. The idea held sudden appeal. He smiled inside, he cleared his throat, then he spoke the words, "I'll do it." The bus sped down the Cascades like a skier. Then the road flattened. Brent saw a man point. He turned and beheld a peak in the distance that seemed a mirage, impossibly high, snow shimmering on its wide shoulders, the absolute lord of the landscape. The word Rainier passed down the aisle. Brent gawked. It seemed too large, as a full moon does when it first rises into view. He'd never been west of Chicago before. He was sure he was there now. He opened his whirligig book and looked through it between glances out the window. He'd found it in the 6th store he tried, a dingy used bookshop downtown on Wabash Avenue. It was an old, loose-spined hardback called Make Your Own Whirligigs and Weather Vanes. A previous owner had penciled tiny, masculine-looking notes in the margins. Brent wondered where the man was at that moment and tried to imagine him from his handwriting. He saw a balding head and glasses. Strange, he thought, that they would never recognize each other if they met. He flipped ahead to a whirligig of a man milking a cow. He'd read only the chapter on supplies. He knew he should have tried building one in Chicago, but he hadn't. Once his probation officer had convinced Brent's parents that the trip might help him, he'd been in a rush to leave. He eyed his blue backpacker's pack on the rack and felt separate from all the other passengers. Their luggage held shirts and pants. His held slabs of plywood, a saw, a hand drill, dowels, brass rods, pliers, a quart of varnish, nails, and paints. He watched his pack closely, dreading his tools spilling out. He'd probably be accused of making bombs. He imagined replying with the truth, that he was a builder of whirligigs. Why not? No one knew anything about him. Here was a chance not simply to alter his past as he'd done in school, but to actually live in a different light. So I want to bring you back to when we were first introduced to Brent. One of the things that he said was a positive or an advantage of moving so many times is that he could make up his past. And I believe he was talking about his dad having a Jaguar in the previous place where they lived in Georgia. So in this instance, Brent is used to making up, his life. However, this is the first time that he can actually live it the way that he made it up, because he certainly can't go back in time and have his father produce a Jaguar. They didn't have that kind of money. So therefore, this is the actual first time where he can forge ahead and do the story that he makes up. It was an interim identity tied to his previous life. He would cast it off soon, but in favor of what? He was lodged in his own chrysalis, but had no idea what he was turning into. So that's a metaphor. Metaphors take a subject and give an inanimate object and give it almost a quality that's a person, or it compares something not using like or as. So he was lodged in his own chrysalis, but had no idea what he was turning into. So that's talking about him as a butterfly, and the chrysalis being the sac before the butterfly comes out. They passed through Preston, then Issaquah. The old man next to Brent was still sleeping. In 24 hours, they hadn't exchanged 10 words. He observed 2 men in front of him, exclaiming over wallet photos, and marveled at how naturally some people spun lines of connection, turning a world of strangers into family. He opened his own wallet, took out Leah's picture, and studied it in solitude. He found her entrancing. She looked Hawaiian, her skin the color of cinnamon, smooth as sanded wood, her forehead high, her hair long and straight. Her eyes were faintly Asian. He probed the photo for new information and now saw that she'd drawn her hair, shiny and black as obsidian, to the sides with a clip. Her dress was white, or was it only a blouse? He examined the pattern embroidered on the bodice. She wore a gold necklace, fine as spider silk, but he couldn't see what hung from it. He scrutinized her smile from close range, almost felt her breath on his face. Strange to think she was now smiling at her killer. Yet she wasn't. Her head was turned at an angle. He stared into her cheerful brown eyes, knowing she would never look back at him, but always off to the side. This was a relief. Her direct gaze would have vaporized him with accusation. He turned the photo over and read her full name, Leah Rosalia Santos Zamora, written in her mother's curly-cued script. She'd given him the picture as a model for the whirligigs, along with a disposable camera. Strangely, she wanted photos of them, but didn't want to know their locations. The idea of coming upon one, she'd told him, rusted or vandalized or fallen over, lifeless like her daughter, was too forbidding. She preferred to see them in her mind, where they would spin forever, safe from all harm. Suburbs appeared out the window. Then the bus nosed its way through a long tunnel and emerged into downtown Seattle. The streets were hilly. Brent glimpsed Puget Sound. He wanted a longer view, but the bus turned, following its usual labyrinthine path to the station. He glanced at his United States map. Interstate 90 ended here, the same road that led all the way back to Chicago, that passed a few miles from his house. He felt himself a departing sailor, leaving the sight of land behind. Now, I can make a personal connection to a road being similar to Interstate 90 that went from Chicago all the way to Seattle. I believe Route 1 in Saco goes all the way down to Florida. So again, I'm just modeling the during reading strategy of making personal connections. The bus found the station. The brakes sighed. He grabbed his pack and climbed down. His voice seemed odd in his ears when he asked for directions to the water. He tightened down his sleeping bag, struggled into his pack, and set off, staggering like a grizzly walking upright. It was early in July and sunny. So I'm going to ask you a thing question. Try to remember when the setting took place at the beginning of the novel. I believe we said it was May, and you can correct me if I'm wrong during Google chat. Right, it's during springtime and it's not as cold as it used to be. I'm trying to find it, but I don't want to take up too much time from reading. So we've already passed a couple of months. He felt himself a departing sailor, leaving the sight of land behind. The bus found the station. The brakes sighed, he grabbed his pack and climbed down. It was early in July and sunny. He sampled the air, amazed at how light it felt, so different from the weighted, humid heat he was used to. He followed bustling Stewart Street, viewing the cars and pedestrians cautiously. How like the afterlife it all was. A populous city, reached only after a long journey toward the setting sun, here all along but never seen until now. Was Leah here somewhere? So now an example of a thick question that I could ask you was, based on Brent's description of the afterlife, what are his views as to what happens to a soul or a spirit? Now, it's a thick question because you're going to have to reflect on your prior knowledge of how people believe in the afterlife. We have Egyptians, we have Roman Catholics, we have Jewish people. All these religions have different ideas of what the afterlife is about. But I can use evidence from the book to support my statement because it says how like the afterlife it all was, a populous city reached only after a long journey toward the setting sun. So it sounds like Brent feels like you enter a light and see tons of people when you get there. Walking on, he jerked at the sight of a face vaguely resembling hers, then arrived at tourist-thronged Pike Place Market. He passed up the chance for a squid burger, bought 2 hot dogs instead, and watched a juggler while he ate. The crowds bothered him. It felt more like Chicago than the pristine Pacific Northwest he'd heard of. He left, following signs to Waterfront Park. This turned out to be Piers and Amusements. He looked over the water. A line of blue mountains floated above the clouds in the distance. That was the Washington he wanted. Leah's mother hadn't specified where in the 4 states he should put the whirligigs. He bought a map and some groceries, walked back to the station, and took the next bus north. He got off in Mount Vernon and pored over his map. He broke his promise to his parents not to hitchhike, found a ride with a fisherman heading west, then walked 3 miles to a state park on the water only to find that the campground was full. He hadn't realized it was 4th of July weekend. Seeing that he'd walked, the ranger suggested he'd try asking if he could share a site. Slowly, Brent meandered through the campground. So I'm going to pause and ask you just to make another personal connection. You guys are only 14 and he is, I think, 16. So it's a couple age difference. How do you think you'd feel meandering through a campground looking to ask somebody to share a site after traveling from Chicago all the way to Seattle? Every site was a separate country, baseball blaring from a radio in one, while the next was occupied by a couple playing duets on soprano recorders. It struck him that every family was a universe, with its own peculiar natural laws. Free of his own family, he imagined himself part of each one he passed, trying on identities like a quick-change artist. He neared the end of the campground. He paused, stealthily eyeing a bearded man unloading his tent from a bicycle. He was tall, fit, looked to be in his 30s, had a thoughtful, sunburned face. The man noticed him, stopped, and turned. Brent felt like a stray dog begging scraps. I was wondering, his voice was rusted from disuse. He cleared his throat. If you'd mind, if you picked out a corner for yourself, be my guest. I'll pay half the fee, Brent added quickly. No need, glad to have the company. The site was on the water and more private than most. Brent was pleased. He took off his pack, pried off his sneakers, waded in up to his calves, and washed his face in Puget Sound. It was too late to begin on the whirligig. He pulled out his tent, an open tube of plastic meant to hang from a rope strung between 2 trees. He'd been sent to a camp for a week a few times, but not lately, and had never camped out on his own. He stood with his rope, unable to find flat ground furnished with properly spaced trees. He hoped the cyclist wasn't watching him and saw the man's dome tent suddenly spring up like a magician's illusion. Brent scanned the sky. It didn't look like rain. He put the tent back and unrolled his sleeping bag. "And what brings you here?" the cyclist asked over dinner. They'd collaborated on the fire. Brent stirred his pan of beef and barley soup. "Just seeing the country," he answered offhandedly. "What about you?" "Riding south from Canada, heading down the coast to San Francisco. Seeing the country like yourself, studying the strange customs of the natives. No offense meant." "Where are you from?" "Prince George, British Columbia, halfway up toward the Yukon." The name raised visions of the far north in Brent's mind. He'd never met a Canadian before and felt like an explorer who just heard tell of an unknown continent. "Ever play Go?" The man asked. The game. Never heard of it. Like to learn? After dinner, the cyclist produced a folding board and 2 tiny boxes of stones, black and white. It's from China originally, like most things. I'm still learning myself. Bought a book about it to study on the trip. He gave Brent the white stones shaped like flying saucers, polished and identical. Supposed to be excellent training for generals. Some say it won the Vietnam War for the North. Wheaties for the brain. I am going to stop here, and I have to laugh because in social studies we've been studying the Vietnam War. So it's kind of interesting that we're reading a book that makes that connection for us.